I'm not a lawyer, but Dan Schneider is suing the producers of Quiet on Set, the Dark Side of Kids TV documentary for defamation. And child, I read the full suit, so let me recap it for you. Y'all seen the doc, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Okay, so Dan is suing Warner Brothers, Maxine Productions, and Sony, which were all producers of the documentary, as well as Mary Robertson and Emma Schwartz, who the suit says were the writers, directors, producers, and editors of the doc. So let's start with the intro, which says that Dan Schneider is best known for creating, writing, and/or producing Nickelodeon's children's TV comedies such as All That, The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, Zoe 101, iCarly, Victorious, all the ones. And it says that Quiet on Set's portrayal of Schneider is, quote, a hit job. While it is indisputable that two bona fide child abusers worked on Nickelodeon shows, it is likewise indisputable that Schneider had no knowledge of their abuse, was not complicit in the abuse, condemned the abuse once it was discovered, and critically was not a child abuser himself. But for the sake of clickbait, ratings, and reviews, or put differently, money, defendants have destroyed Schneider's reputation and legacy through the false statements and implications that Schneider is exactly that. It also says that Schneider will be the first to admit that some of what they said is true. At times he was blind to the pain that some of his behaviors caused certain colleagues, subordinates, and cast members. But one thing he is not is an abuser. And then the suit goes on to explain exactly what defamation is. And there are two types. The first is slander and the second is libel. Slander is when something is spoken or said out loud that charges any person with a crime or having been indicted, convicted, or punished for a crime or tends to injure him with respect to his office, profession, trade, or business. And then libel defamation is when something is written or printed which exposes someone to hatred, ridicule, or causes them to be shunned or avoided, which may also negatively affect them in terms of their job. So I've actually been researching defamation a lot recently and the different kinds. So low-key, I'm kind of hyped to understand all this. Quick short version is that, again, slander is when something is said out loud, and libel defamation is when things are written or printed that you can like see with your eye. But y'all know I'm not a lawyer. The suit goes on to say that the voiceover and graphics in Quiet on Set and its trailer were edited together in a way that purposefully and falsely states or implies that Schneider is an abuser and committed crimes in this regard. And because of all of these edits, the people watching interpreted all of this to mean that Schneider was an abuser. And the suit says the producers did this on purpose, like they wanted us to believe that. Further down in the lawsuit, it begins to give examples of what exactly they mean. It says that in the first 5 seconds, the trailer describes Nickelodeon as, quote, kid everything, before showing video clips of child audiences and cast members, and then it quickly turns to Schneider with a voiceover that says, and this is when Dan Schneider arrives, Nickelodeon's golden boy. He created these shows that were hugely successful for them. The trailer goes on to show more pics and videos of the kids and Dan, really putting across to the viewers that there's this connection between Dan and the kids and the audience. But then at the 39-second mark, the voiceover on the trailer comes on and says, quote, but that marked one of the darkest chapters. And then it cuts to a graphic of the ID logo and all cap words that says, quote, true crime event. So the suit says, making that strong connection between Dan and the kids and the audience, and then this true crime graphic implies that Dan Schneider committed a crime, a true crime, and one that involves children. After the logo, the suit says that the trailer cuts to a picture of Schneider and the voiceover comes on again and says, quote, working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship. Dan's treatment of people on his shows was an open secret, which the suit says the phrase an open secret is a loaded one and it was used on purpose. An Open Secret is a 2014 documentary film that exposes child abuse and the film industry in California. That film had nothing to do with Schneider and does not mention him in any way whatsoever, but the suit says using that phrase in the Quiet on Set documentary was intentional. There are more examples from the trailer that the suit goes into before it dives into the actual documentary itself with examples from that. It highlights that in episode 1, there's a bunch of images of Dan where he is called, quote, golden boy, a cash cow, a person who launched the careers of child actors, and then a tweet is shown accusing Schneider of inappropriate behavior before showing side-by-side images of Dan Schneider with his arm around a child actress and then his hand on the back of that same actress. And then according to the suit, the whole episode dives into content that Dan Schneider created or wrote, saying that he, quote, made children do things that were very weird. Another quote from the documentary that's highlighted in the suit is, quote, there are all these setups that referenced corn. And again, the suit is saying all of this stuff was done and said to imply to viewers that Schneider was an abuser. At the end of the first episode, where it previews some of the upcoming episodes, there's a voiceover that says, quote, Van Nuys Division officers have arrested a suspected child predator charged with kissing and touching a 9-year-old girl, but officers believe that there may be more victims. The background doesn't show who the predator is or gives their name, and because at this point, according to Dan Schneider, the focus of the entire episode had only been on Dan Schneider, the lawsuit says that it left viewers believing that the predator in this case was Dan Schneider. There's another example from episode 2 listed out in the lawsuit, which says that the documentary exaggerated Dan Schneider's relationship with Brian Peck, the convicted abuser in the documentary. And then after describing Brian Peck's abuse, the episode immediately cuts to a picture of Dan Schneider instead of showing the convicted abuser, Brian Peck. Quick note, and this is included in the lawsuit, when a public figure or like a celebrity files a defamation lawsuit, they have to prove that the person who defamed them knew what they were saying or writing or printing was a lie, and they did it anyway, which equals malice. Think like Cardi B, Tasha K. So Dan Schneider is saying that the defendants, the producers and the writers, directors, all knew that Dan Schneider has never committed or been charged or convicted with a crime toward children. And they put out these statements and implications with reckless and malicious disregard for the truth. The suit says that, quote, the defendants purposefully stated or implied that Dan Schneider abused children on his show in order to generate interest, and it worked as intended. Defendant Robertson spoke to this motivation in recent interviews where she stated, quote, when we released the trailer for Quiet on Set, it went viral almost immediately and questions started swirling. The lawsuit goes on to show what Dan says was malicious intent by referencing an investigative report of Dan that was conducted by the New York Times in 2021. Apparently, after numerous interviews with former coworkers, friends, and television execs about Dan Schneider, there was no reported evidence of child abuse or misconduct with respect to any of the children who worked on Dan Schneider's shows. According to this lawsuit, the producers all knew about this investigative report from 2021 and again still chose to put this information out the way that they did. So Dan says his reputation and career have been irreparably harmed by the trailer and Quiet on Set's defamatory and malicious content. The harm to his reputation, career, and business and emotional distress cannot be understated. And so he's suing all of them for defamation. So that's the lawsuit. Just to be clear, I'm just recapping the lawsuit. So don't come for me in those comments.